let's begin by pivoting off of the school finance lawsuit, since that's the most immediate thing on people's minds. We're sort of in halftime, maybe that's the right way to say it, of this lawsuit. Judge Dietz having handed down his decision. We're waiting now to see how the Supreme Court decision goes. Let me start with the two people who are most involved in this case, Mr. Thompson and Chairman Grusendorf. Mr. Thompson, from your perspective, I guess you'd say on the winning side up to this point, would you talk about what you intended to accomplish by getting in that lawsuit and how you interpret, briefly, but let's do substance here, how you interpret Judge Dietz's ruling and what you anticipate is going to happen on the lawsuit next?
What we hope to accomplish is exactly what our Constitution has required since 1876. And that is not only that we establish a system of public free schools, but that we suitably provide for that system so that all of our children are able to meet the high standards that we set for all of our kids in Texas. Our group represents over 1.8 million kids. That's the largest group of children that have ever been represented in any of these lawsuits, and it's a very diverse group. Our group has both Chapter 41 districts and Chapter 42 districts.
Explain, please, for the benefit of the audience,
a Chapter 42 district is, I would say generally it's average funding or lower, and it's very dependent on the state funding formulas. Right. It is not a recapture district. Chapter 41 is a provision of our education code that is shorthand for the wealthier districts in the state that may even have so much revenue that they have to give some back
from
to the
whom we
state
take revenue and
in the form of recapture. And recapture total in Texas right now is about $1 billion a year of local property taxes that get sent back to the state.
So you went in saying inadequate, inequitable, and unconstitutional.
Our position is we have an inadequate system because it doesn't fund the standards that we're setting for all kids.
Right.
Our position is it's inequitable because we don't equitably lift all districts to those standards, provide revenue necessary to meet the standards. We believe the system is arbitrary, and I can say more about that in a bit. And we also believe that once again, as in 2005, we've backed into a local property tax, when the state property tax. When the state gets so dependent on local property taxes as the primary basis to support public schools, that a local property tax operates as if it were a state revenue source, a state property tax. Our Supreme Court has fairly commonsensically said for many years, if it looks and operates like a state property tax, we're going to call it a state property
So Judge Dietz's ruling essentially affirmed all of the points you
Judge Dietz, this was the most sweeping ruling in any of the rulings going back to Edgewood 1. Judge Dietz found the system unconstitutional on all grounds.
Okay. Now, Mr. Chairman, your group, TREE, I guess we can call it TREE by short, although there's an extra E, TREE was a party to this lawsuit, but not in the same way that the group Mr. Thompson represented was a party. Can you talk about that and what you attempted to accomplish by way of your participation in the suit?
Well, our intent was to represent all 5 million students in the state of Texas, actually from a school student perspective as opposed to school district establishment perspective and the fight between the haves and the have-nots in the school system. And our lawsuit is really based on the core constitutional requirement of efficiency. The Texas Constitution calls for an efficient system of public free schools. And the Texas Supreme Court has said that efficiency is an explicit constitutional requirement, whereas the constitutional requirements that David Thompson has litigated on, adequacy and equity, the Texas Supreme Court has said that those are only implicit constitutional requirements. So we've gone to the core of the constitutional issue that the system must be efficient. Also, if I can back up just a second, Evan, Judge Dietz has not actually ruled. Judge Dietz has indicated verbally from the bench what he intends to rule.
We haven't seen papers
but
yet.
He has not issued a written ruling. And until we see that written ruling, we don't really know the details of his ruling.
You have any reason to think that our interpretation of his ruling based on what he has said will differ from what we actually see in in paper?
No, I think he's going to rule basically what he said, but there's a lot of nuances
Of
to
course.
that. I think he will do exactly what he said he would do.
Right.
But there, like I said, there's a lot of detail in that we have not seen. Until we see that written ruling, we really don't know where we're going.
Tell us quickly, how is the perception of your group, how is the state not living up to the efficiency standard? And what was the basis for your decision to get involved in this legally?
Well, we're probably the only party to the lawsuit that received a written invitation from the Texas Supreme Court to intervene in this lawsuit. In the West Orange Court case, the Supreme Court said that perhaps the system could be made more efficient through competition and not wasting so much money. But that issue has not been before the court, and so therefore we can't rule on it at this time. So basically in West Orange, they put this invitation out there that somebody needs to bring the issue of true efficiency before the Supreme Court. And like I said, the court has said previously that efficiency is an explicit requirement of the Constitution, whereas the adequacy and equity. So we're going to win this lawsuit. I think we're in the best position of anybody. I know David differs with that.
Well,
he tried real hard to get us out of it because he differs with it.
Kent, we made no effort whatsoever to get you out of the lawsuit, and I want you to correct your statement on that regard. We made no opposition.
Didn't you sign on to that filing
Absolutely
at the
not.
end?
No.
I'm sorry then, I
And so
apologize.
let's get our facts
all the
straight.
other school folks signed on to a petition to try to get us out of the lawsuit.
We
I
did
thought
not.
David did too.
No.
Mr. Chairman, so Judge Dietz's verbal decision, we don't have the actual ruling, as you correctly point out, found for Mr. Thompson's side, but in your case, Judge Dietz, if I understand correctly, said this is really a matter for the legislature to address, not the courts.
That's what he said verbally.
And you are hoping that the Supreme Court sees this differently.
I think the Supreme Court will definitely see that different, because if they said adequacy and equity are implicit and efficiency
Then why
is
would-
explicit,
Yeah.
then they're basically saying efficiency is a higher standard, and basically equity and adequacy are components of efficiency. They're only components
Right.
to the efficiency argument.
Mr. Chairman, you get to be a spectator to this, even though you've been so deeply involved in public education for so many years from the legislature side, legislative perspective. What is your sense of this battle going on here, and of Judge Dietz's ruling, and where do you think this goes now?
Well, I've always, here we go. I've always been a fan of being able to sing in the choir. No, I've always been a fan of efficiency, because I've seen the trends for how we spend our money on schools, on education, and the way we've been doing that, we've not been getting the results that most people would expect when they put more money into something. Now, you know, there are other factors, but efficiency is something that we're going to have to be very aware of in the future, because when you look at competing requirements for funding, look at transportation. I mean, we're in debt trying to build roads. Health and Human Services, that's a big battle. In fact, that's your big story next month.
Yeah.
And pensions. So there's not going to be a whole lot of government money to go around. So I've been interested in the efficiency aspect of, you know, what school districts are getting more for their dollars spent than others, and there are some good measures of that, and that's something I've been very interested in.
Your sense going into this case, we'll come to Mr. Thompson in a second. Your sense going into this case, Mr. Chairman, is you did not believe that the state system of funding public education was unconstitutional. You did not, or you did?
Well, in certain aspects, I've seen, for example, I gave a deposition in the lawsuit.
In support of?
Well, in the efficiency aspect,
Yeah,
and,
right.
and my job was to talk about how the legislative process adds to the inefficiency of the system.
Of course, that process was in your hands for several sessions.
As much as it is in anybody.
Right,
Well, thank you,
so
thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
You're right. In as much, and it's funny, they say, Rob, how do you like lobbying? I said, I've always been lobbying, because when you have a public ed bill
Even internally you lobby.
You are lobbying everybody.
Right, but
You're always selling.
So you believe that the system was unconstitutional?
The system per se, I'll have to say there are aspects of it that continue to make it worse. okay? Because the school funding formulas do exactly what they're intended to do. It's an algebra problem.
Let me give Mr. Hochberg a quick
And
in
then I
here
wanna
before we come
comment.
right back to you,
Yeah.
Mr. Thompson. Is the system unconstitutional, Scott?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think the court and Kent talks about clear indications from the court.
Yeah.
I think the court has said on a number of occasions, first of all, that districts that are similarly situated with similar tax rates ought to have similar revenues per comparable student.
Right.
We've gotten so out of whack on that it's not even predictable anymore. We talked about Chapter 41 and Chapter 42 districts. Even those definitions have become meaningless. It
Yeah.
looks like I was in D.C. and I happened to walk into the National Museum of Art, and there was Jackson Pollock stuff on the wall, and I said, "Wow, school finance," because it was this random scattering of dots.
Yeah.
And it looks just like how our school finance system works today.
Right.
So we're out of whack there. And when you have districts that adjoin each other, that are competing in the same labor market, and one has significantly more money than the other per student or per same student,
Yeah.
then you've created an adequacy problem, at least for the district that's on the low end.
Yeah.
And no matter how much money you put in or how much you take out, you've still got that problem if this guy has $30,000, $40,000 more dollars per classroom than the one sitting next to it.
What about the efficiency argument you've heard Chairman Eisler and Chairman Grusendorf make? Is there any merit to the efficiency argument?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I've never seen in the court rulings that I've read where efficiency in that context
Yeah.
was used. Efficiency has been determined, as Kent said, in terms of the financial efficiency of whether the tax collection and distribution system is efficient.
But if I understand Mr. Grusendorf's group's point here, is that we have a bloated bureaucracy, we have a lot of regulation that may not be necessary. We're not running a streamlined operation that will produce ultimately the best results. Is that a fair
Absolutely.
statement? Do you-
And Rob can speak to this better than I can in the amount of increase in funding over the last decade or so that we've put into it and how those results relate to the.
Right.
But I think, and back to Scott's point on equity, I sat through the 14 weeks of the trial, and quite honestly, I think the plaintiffs have a better case on equity than they do on adequacy.
adequacy.
But in truth of the matter, and we had witnesses testify to this, should we really be talking about equity for school districts? Because that's what all the litigation is about. Or should we be talking about equity for students? That's what we need to be talking about, in my opinion.
How is
That's
that different, Mr. Grusendorf?
Well, if you just talk about trying to level the playing field for various bureaucracies, what are you doing for those kids? And we need to focus on the results of the kids. And we had several witnesses testify that, hey, if you want real equity, give every kid a voucher or credit or some kind of scholarship program. Allow them to go to the best school to meet their needs. So if we're going to really talk about equity, why don't we talk about equity for kids, not just equity for school districts?
Mr. Horton, do you have any?
I've got to jump in on this. First of all, I think every one of us supports equity, hopefully. Hopefully every one of us supports adequacy in the sense of we provide what's necessary to actually meet the standards we're setting.
Right.
And every one of us supports efficiency. This notion, Evan, before we get further, that there's the efficiency argument that's somehow distinct from the other argument.
Disaggregated
is
from
really
the other.
silly. I think every school in Texas works very hard to make the best use we can of the dollars that are available.
Right.
And I'm going to tell you, the data is absolutely clear that in Texas, we get above average results for below average expenditures. That's not the issue. The issue is whether we're getting what we need to reach the high standards we've set for every kid. And I will go back, Ken, to something you just said about equity for students. Because I think we've all known each other. I've known every one of y'all before you were in the legislature. Rob, I represented you when you were on a local school board. And I've known you during your entire service and since you've been out of the legislature. But I want to ask you a question. 60% of our kids in Texas schools come from low-income homes. And that is increasing by about 1% a year. Virtually any analysis you do is going to tell you that's your best proxy. It correlates to educational performance because it's a measure It's a proxy for stability of the home and educational level in the home, particularly educational level of the mother. 60% of our kids are low income. Now here's the question I want to ask you and I want to ask our audience. As a district, as the percentage of low income kids increases in a district, does the job get harder or easier? Is it harder to have 25% low-income kids or 75% low-income kids in your district?
So let's stipulate that it's harder.
Let me finish
right?
the example. It's harder. So do you think as the percentage of low-income kids goes up in a district, you ought to get more money or less money?
What do
The
you
job's
think?
getting harder. Should you get more money or less money as you go to 60, 70, 80, 90% of your kids being low income?
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you what the analysis is.
Thank you.
Kent,
Thank you
let
for
me
that
finish.
soft-
Let me finish this.
Oh, okay.
The analysis indicates, let me get the fact out and then we can debate it. In Texas today, and I think every one of us probably wouldn't intentionally design a system this way, but it's a fact about our system. As the percentage of low-income kids increases in school districts, the revenue available per weighted student declines in a straight line. You get less money per weighted student in Texas as the number of harder to educate or more needy kids increases. That is a definition of an unsuitable system. It is not structured, funded, or operated to meet its purpose for all kids.
Let me let Chairman
That is
Grisendorf.
that is a fundamental flaw in our system that until we deal with that, we're going to have an unconstitutional system.
Chairman Eisler is saying that that is not true. The premise of
It's
Mr. Thompson's
absolutely
question
true.
is not true. Do you-
I think the premise is flawed, but let me first of all say, in our lawsuit, we didn't debate the issue of adequacy. We did not really challenge the plaintiff attorneys on their more money, although all the school superintendents testified, basically give us more money and hold us less accountable. We really
That's
didn't
not
get into
true.
that. It's basically true. If you read the transcript.
let's let him have his moment.
But I think you gave me a softball question there on the money and the disadvantaged kids, because if you remember in the testimony, we had Yes Prep Academy testified before the court. And Yes Prep has about, I think if I remember right, about 70% economically disadvantaged students. 100% of their students are college ready, and they spend about $500 less per child than the typical public schools. And if we had virtually every school superintendent tell us that they were not producing college-ready students and that they didn't have enough money, and if they had more money, that would solve the problem. Yes Prep is doing it at less money and very efficiently. Why don't we look at the types of things, and quite honestly, David has testified for years for more deregulation. We took the approach,
Yep.
we need to deregulate our public schools, give them the flexibility that our charter schools have, and allow them to do a better job. Of course, the unions fight that tooth and toenail, but there's a lot of inefficiency in our labor laws, and we talked about that in the lawsuit. When you have a law in place that prohibits a principal or a school superintendent from firing the duds, the system is inefficient, folks. How can any rational human being say that's an efficient system? But that's what we do on our laws. We put all these rules and regulations. We tie school superintendents' hands behind their back, and we expect them to do a good job. So right now, the only solution, so long as you leave their hands tied behind their back, you got to get them more money. But you've got to go to the core of the issue and redesign the system, allow it to be efficient.
Vice Chairman.
I've got to go back to Yes Prep. And I love the work that Yes Prep does, but I have to correct the data. And they're in my district. I'm very familiar with them. They've been in my district, the district I used to represent.
Old habits, blah, blah, blah.
I still
get
love
that.
them.
That's fine.
I still live there. But that statistic is clearly wrong, and here's why.
That's what we
Which
testified to, Scott.
statistic? Which one?
The
All I'm
statistic
doing
that
is
100%.
quoting the trial
I understand,
testimony.
and I've heard it before, and it's an argument that gets made for exactly this same reason and is used in these kinds of discussions. 100% of Yes Prep kids who graduate from Yes Prep may in fact be college ready, but guess what? there's a pretty significant attrition rate between being a freshman at ES Prep High School and being a senior at ES Prep High School. They are not dropouts under the state definition, because when they leave, they go back to Lee High School or Sharpstown High School or any of those other high schools, and they don't show up as dropouts. So they have a 0 dropout and 100% college readiness, but nowhere near all the kids who come in are the same kids who go out.
Are there any public schools that are doing that good a job?
Yes, and I respect the work, and I respect the work that Yes does, and I respect the work that Harmony does, and that KIP does, and they're all in my area in Southwest Houston. But that kind of number distorts the conversation. There are no magic bullets. And the second half of that is the money they're spending. Because while I think the number you're quoting from what I've seen may be state funding.
$500 less
It's
per
all-
student
Maybe.
than state
It's-
funding.
They said it was total
Maybe.
funding.
They said it was total
funding.
money?
It includes what he's comparing it to.
Compares to
includes
facilities, but
On the
does not-
operating side, they're
but do-
slightly above
But
average.
does not include the amount of money that they raise externally,
Correct.
which is substantial.
That's
And
one of the
again,
big
I
differences.
bless their hearts for it.
Right.
They do a great job.
Chairman.
And you look at spending, okay? And David, the more free and reduced lunch kids you have, that's what we base our comp ed on, which is 20% more than the basic allotment. It's a 0.2, and then language learners are a 0.1. So it's at least 20% more than a well-to-do student, because we spend more. We have increased the spending on the gaps, and they have increased over the last
But
5
you heard
years.
Mr. Thompson say that the line goes down as you
I
get
can
more
show you.
kids.
As your percentage of low-income
You shook your
kids
head and said that's not true.
increases,
No, I've not
your
seen
money
that.
goes down.
No.
Absolutely true.
No.
Yep.
Because those are typically
Actually,
42
you can make the
districts
argument
that are poor, right?
The what
You know,
now?
You
to
still
be
have
fair,
offset
Evan,
balance.
Yeah.
there was mixed testimony on that in the trial. We had testimony to the contrary, and David's pointing to the testimony he likes, but,
But you think that there's evidence
it's
in
a
the
fact.
contrary.
The formulas are 0.2.
Well,
And Rob, the last
Rob?
time you looked at the weights was before you were in the
Okay.
legislature.
Rob, you're
Let me
right.
let-
You're
These
right
are
that
20
the
and 25 years old.
Well, I know the
You're,
way.
Rob, you're right that the formula says 0.2, but that's 0.2 times a basic
basic
number.
allotment.
And the
Before we-
basic allotment is all over the park because of the disequities in
It's
the
lower
in the
to
basic
start with.
system.
we're a
So
little
that
bit down
makes
in,
more
we're a
than
little bit
makes
down
sense.
We're
in the
in the
weeds.
weeds,
We're a little bit
yeah.
in the weeds. I'd like to get out the mower here, okay?
And we went from 32.18 to 47.65.
Let me take this conversation back up to a level where everybody could see it, and get to this question of that per student spending number, because again, you all are talking about per
Right.
student spending. Is yes
But
spending
if-
less?
If the amount of money spent per child would make education better, we would have solved that a long time ago.
And let's go
in the
right
last-
there.
In the last 40 years, and this is from Stretching the School Dollar, is a book by anyway, it doesn't matter. We have.
Good old
we-
what's his name?
Well, I'll think of it and then I'll fix your wagon. We've tripled what we spend on public education in the last 40 years with no appreciable gain.
Well, let's get
SATs
right to
or-
that. So the what I referred to in the
And-
introduction of this, Mr. Chairman, was that we are now spending $8,400.
And we have school districts, that spend considerably less with high
With better
percentage-
performance.
With much better performance.
So-
And I'll give you some examples.
Go there in a second. So
All right, I'll go there in a
8,400. So
second.
people understand this. It's $8,400 per enrolled public school student is, according to this most recent survey, what Texas is spending. National average is $11,500 per student. So we are spending,
Well,
according to this,
That's not right either.
you can jump on this, but let me get the
You're not
numbers out,
including
and then
facilities.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the study that just came out that
52.
compared the state of Texas to the other 49 states plus
Yep.
DC, and it showed, you guys can pick at this, it showed $8,400 per enrolled public school student versus an average of $11,500 nationally. That put us $3,100 below. We were 41st in per student spending prior to the 2011 session. It says that we are 49th now. Now, have at that. Go ahead. What don't you like about those stats? I mean, I'm more than happy to have you challenge them. They're not my stats. I don't take it personally, but go ahead. What's wrong with What's wrong with those stats?
Well, they don't include what we spend on facilities. For example, in the last 5 years, our debt service has gone up like 40%.
Right.
Just because we're building a lot
So
more
where do you
schools.
think, Mr.
So
Chairman,
we're
we fit,
spending-
if you make the, true up the numbers then, where are we nationally?
Well, 52 billion divided by 5 million is about 10.4 per student.
And do you know where
Okay?
that would, if
But-
you true up
but
the other
spending-
states, where would that put us compared to the other states?
Well, they're probably not growing as fast as we are. And why does where you rank on school spending an indicator of, number one, how much you care about it, or how well you're doing?
I just
As
think it's an
example,
indicator of how much you spend. I don't think it's anything more than that.
As an example, if you look at the quality count survey, it looked at 4 factors. It looked educational level of the parents, the poverty level, the employment, and the language. Okay,
Yeah.
those 4 areas, and ranked the NAEP scores with all the rest. Number 1 in raw scores was Massachusetts. Okay, and in performance above starting point, because Texas was in those 4 areas like 47th on. We're number 4 in the country in corrected for demographics against our starting point.
I want to get,
So
So
Texas
are we
does well. Texas does very well. But the amount of money you spend does not indicate, well, gee, you spend a whole lot of money. Highland Park is not the best school district for what it.
if money mattered, that's what it would be.
So
Yeah.
I'm confused because he's arguing that the schools stink and he's arguing that they're very good, and I'm not quite sure which side of the
Chairman, I want to give you a crack at both the statistics, which you seem to have an issue with, and also the general point that somehow there's a correlation, because I know you, and then we'll let Mr. Hochberg and Mr. Thompson in on that. Go ahead.
Well, where do I start here?
Well, what's wrong with, for one thing, what's wrong with the stats? What's wrong with the stats?
There's so much data here. First of all, your $8,400 didn't include facilities, and if you have you've got to look at total spending to compare to me. That makes sense. But I'm gonna come back to the point. I don't really care. I'm willing to give the schools more money. What I'm wanting to do, what I'm focusing on, is let's spend that money wisely. Let's make sense. Let's do it in a way that actually promotes student achievement and doesn't just feed a bureaucracy. We're really doing some things in the state of Texas pretty stupidly. And until we get a handle on those things and make some changes, there's never going to be enough money, folks, to feed the beast or to fill the black hole. So you've got to make some structural changes, and then, okay, you can fight about the money. I really hate to get into this argument about money, but we spend about $11,000 per kid in the state of Texas when you consider facilities, TRS, when you look at total spending per student. On the performance, we had a lot of mixed testimony on the trial. Eric Hanishak is probably the leading economist in the nation on school finance. He was one of our expert witnesses in the trial. He did graphs all through the state of Texas, looking at various school districts, looking at their demographics, looking at what they spend, and looking at student actually raw test scores. Didn't find a correlation. Some of the other experts found, the state experts did not find a correlation with spending. Now you can, like you say, statistics, you can do anything with them you want. So they had experts testify that, yeah, there's correlation. David is right that they all found that the economically disadvantaged kids do require more. So that part is right. But to find a direct correlation between spending and results, at best, it was a mixed bag in the testimony. Again, that's not my case. I'm willing to spend more money.
Right.
I want results for 5 million kids.
But
not just the kids David represents, not just the districts or the kids that in districts that the equity lawsuit represent. I want equity and accountability and performance for 5 million kids in the state of Texas, because we as Texas taxpayers, that's what we're paying for, and that's what we ought to demand.
You quarreled, Mr. Grisendorf, in the introduction of this program with the TEA statistics that I cited, that when you looked at based on, I don't know if you may know, Scott, if it was 2010 or 2011, the rankings of
Doesn't matter.
schools.
Any
that-
year.
Yeah, that the exemplary schools spent on average $1,000 per student more than the unacceptable schools. You quarrel with that. I want to give you an opportunity to tell me why I'm wrong.
Well,
Stick it up my nose. Why is that?
It's meaning, I think Scott's the first one that came out with that analysis. That's a meaningless number. You've got to look at student
I thought you were going to compliment me on it, Ken. I'm so disappointed.
I mean, go ahead.
Well, no,
No, no,
please.
no,
I mean, go ahead.
Go
I
ahead.
do want to know why you think
Why-
that's
tell me
why
why
is
you
that a
think it's a bad
meaningless
number.
statistic? I'd like to hear that.
Because you're ranking, okay, what does exemplary mean in the state of Texas?
90%.
What does recognized mean in the state of Texas? If you're going to try to make a correlation between dollars and student performance, the only rational way to do it is to base it on raw student scores. Then you can adjust it for demographic differences if you choose to, and which a lot of experts did, and which I think is rational and reasonable. But when you just use your state classifications, it tells you absolutely nothing about the correlation between performance and money.
So we should not have confidence, Mr. Chairman, in the TEA's
Well, that-
assessment of performance?
TEA actually put up data relating to my argument in the trial and not relating. I mean, TEA data actually presented in the trial showed no correlation between dollars spent and performance. But again, that's not my argument. We can get into that quagmire, but I really don't like to fuss over the dollars. I'd really like to look at the structure of the system
Yep.
and change the system to benefit 5 million kids in the state of Texas.
Mr. Hochberg and then Mr. Thompson, I want you to get in on this.
I am going to fuss over the dollars because dollars matter. And whether you like the accountability system or not, I have criticisms of it. Rob does, and there's a whole bunch of people over in the pink building who are making changes in it
Right.
probably as we speak. But the point is, the mandate we've given to school districts for the last 20 years has been that your goal is to become exemplary. That's the rating system. That's what they put on their walls outside the schools. Your goal is not to be low performing. And so the numbers that I developed, that your staff also developed, that TEA
So
developed.
if one of my students in
Hang
my
on.
district
Let me
drops out
finish.
and I've
Let me
moved down
finish.
in the rank, would you see my problem, what I'm talking about?
Let me finish.
It doesn't really make rational sense.
Would you, let me at least make the
We'll
point
come
that you
back.
say doesn't make sense. If you look at the districts year after year, doesn't matter what year you look at, doesn't matter if you accumulate over years, doesn't matter how you play it. If you take the revenue per weighted student, comparing same student, and you look at exemplary versus recognized versus acceptable versus low performing, it stair steps right down. And it starts, and the difference between the two is about $1,000 per kid. It doesn't matter where. Now, the other thing that happens is, as you go down those rankings, the exemplary districts in our state, the last time we did rankings, because those are on hold right now while the new STAR system comes in, have about 17% of their kids are on free and reduced lunch. The low-performing districts have about 80, it's 83 to 85 or 88, I don't remember the number, and I didn't bring the chart, but it's somewhere in that range.
Let me add something to that, Scott.
Okay.
Okay, and that is the mid-size and small school adjustment is what gives the extra money in our formulas, because most of those exemplary school districts are very small. Okay.
But I'm talking. No, I'm talking. Wait a minute.
Our current accountability system measures demographics more than it measures performance.
The goal that
That's
people
the
have,
extra money.
the goal that, well, but wait a minute, I'm doing it per weighted student, so that's all rolled in. Even once you consider that, Rob, it's rolled into it. Now, it may even be exaggerated more by the mid-size and small school adjustment, but this is clean of those adjustments.
Because
It has been, the LBB used to do this study long before I did it. And they came up with the same results, and they kept coming up with it. And so finally somebody said, don't do the study anymore because we don't want to see those results. If those are the goals we're giving districts, and regardless of what you say about individual students, that I would agree with you on getting to the individual student level, what we've been telling districts is do this.
When you look at individual student level, you find no difference in spending and performance. I mean, that's the data.
I don't know that. I don't know whether that's true.
But-
I know that
but
what we've
Rob
asked.
Rob has got a
what-
really good point there, that the formulas overcompensate for these small school districts, and small districts tend to do better because of the communities as much as anything.
I watched-
And they get a lot more money. You get districts that get $16,000 and $20,000 per kid just because they're so
Ken,
small.
I don't, but, and
So-
that
so
makes
that-
it, and
so
that
that skews
exaggerates the
entire
effect even
numbers.
beyond, that exaggerates the effect even beyond those skews, because I used weighted students in the calculation.
I will agree that our formulas do spread the money incorrectly.
I mean, here's
agree with that.
here's where it comes down to.
And
Look,
it comes down to the CEI.
look,
Can I make
here's-
a couple comments?
let me make, can I make one more?
One more, and
close?
then please let David
Okay,
in.
I will. And then I'll,
Boy, this is a much more unruly panel than I expected.
you know,
You gotta get in control here.
Evan,
Next week, to calm
'cause
things
we've
down,
known
we'll have
each
a
other
panel
so
on
long.
abortion. How about that?
That's because
Evan, nobody has asked any of us for our opinions in at least 12 months.
I know,
So
okay,
it's all got, it's all,
Right, the cork is being pushed out of the bottle. Right.
all come
It's
out.
like old timers' day here at the LB Day School.
it's exactly right.
All right. Go ahead and make your point, and then let
look,
David in.
In the district I used to represent, I had Alief School District and Houston ISD. There's very similar graphics between the two. Neither one of them were getting small school adjustments. They're both large districts.
Yeah.
On one side of Gessner Road, you were worth $600 less than if you moved to the other side of Gessner
Literally
Road.
across the road.
okay, that's all right.
That is $600 times a typical classroom size, which I guess now is more than 22 to 1, and whatever it is, times the number of
I'll tell
kids
you.
in those districts, you're talking about real money.
Real money.
And so maybe if you get really super terrific folks in the poorer district, you can make that work. But we had some super terrific folks, and they're pretty easy to recruit away by the district that has more money. Yeah. And so you can argue all of these things, but to me, if you don't get that basic piece right, you're going to put a lot of districts at a permanent disadvantage, and you've created permanent inadequacy, regardless of the monetary amount, amongst a group of districts who simply
Right.
can't compete with their neighbors.
Mr. Thompson.
Couple of quick points. Ken, I do not personally believe in general that small districts are overfunded. They clearly get higher levels of funding, but if you're having to teach the same courses, if you're teaching physics or calculus to 10 or 12 students in a class instead of 25, your cost per student are going to tend to be higher. So I don't think we
which skews
solved
the correlation.
I don't think we solved this issue simply by focusing on the extremes of smaller districts. We've got well over 1,000 districts in Texas, which we all know. Half of our kids are in the largest 60 districts. We're going to fail or succeed as a state in terms of how we do in those larger communities where literally a majority of our kids are. And if we don't focus on those needs, we're going to be in trouble. So that's point number one. Point number two, it's not just about district accreditation ratings, where there is clearly a correlation to revenue. If you look at student performance, the percentage of kids who meet commended on the old tax, which is actually still our high school graduation measure right now as we're making the transition, increases in a direct line as you have more money. Now that not only makes the point that money well used makes a difference, it tends to make the point that districts are in fact using their money better, because districts that have more money get more kids to commended on both math and English. And third, if you look at the performance last year on the first round of STAR exam of ninth graders, guess what the correlation was to in districts? It was revenue in the districts. Districts that had more money had a higher percentage of their kids pass all 5 tests, and again, a straight line correlation. So whether you're looking at district characteristics, whether you're looking at different measures of student characteristics, there's a clear correlation. And one last comment, Rob. Your look at the NAEP data and Texas ranking 4th, that's absolutely true. I mean, there are different ways to massage the data, but you made a comment that when adjusted for demographics, And I think we need to be clear to our audience that in that analysis, the way Texas looks good is they compare how our Anglo students are doing compared to Anglo students elsewhere, how our Hispanic students are doing compared to other Hispanic students in other states, how our African American, and the point I want to make is that's fine. That's certainly a way to analyze the data, and in fact, the state presented the data that way in the lawsuit. Here's the point I want to make. We don't have different standards for kids in Texas based on their ethnicity or their income status. We have the same expectations for every kid.
I know that.
And I think we all support that.
and
So
the real-
so when we look at the data, I don't personally think it's appropriate to look at data that frankly makes us look better simply by putting a demographic massage.
Let me let you say a word in response, then I have a last question for all of you before we let the audience into this.
Well, the real legitimate is not race. The legitimate
income
difference
status.
is poverty.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's the difference, and that's the difference, and that's the only real correlation.
Yeah.
And that's why our
and-
system is the most screwed up.
Well, our system, you mean America's, or are you
I'm
talking
talking
about
about our
Texas?
Texas school finance
Well,
system in Texas
well,
that we have all had our
And
fingers
part of
on
my,
at one
part
point
of my
or another.
9-hour deposition in that lawsuit was
Yep.
talking about how it gets to be that way.
Yep.
And we could do a whole deal
We can do a
on
whole
that.
other program on poverty. That's
Yep.
exactly right.
And part of it is how the legislative process plays to groups and people to be held harmless, and that's another argument
Yeah.
on ASETAR or target revenue, which is going to be another problem.
So let's talk about the what now part. This panel is called School Finance What Now. We've talked about school finance. Now let's get to the what now part as the last question. So we have this Supreme Court appeal that's proceeding.
Once these issues are written ruling.
Right. Judge Deese talked about in the course of his verbal ruling the possibility that the state may be underfunding public education to the tune of $2,000 per enrolled public school student, giving the prospect to all of us that we have to find $10 billion per year or $20 billion per biennium. Now, I went into journalism not to have to do math, but I could do that math. And I suspect that that means the only thing we do if we end up in that situation is that we have to pass a tax bill, because you're not going to get that money out of the budget under current circumstances. So I want to ask you all where you think this is likely headed. If you want to bias it in favor of where you want it to be headed, that's fine. But I want you to take a stab at look into the future and trying to put all the factors at play here together. Where do you think this is ultimately going? 1 year from now, or 18 months from now, where will this conversation be, beginning with Chairman Grusendorf?
Oh, me, I get to start?
Yes.
Well, okay, if I look at the lawsuit, 18 months from now, 12 months from now, 8 months, whenever the Supreme Court rules, I look at it like what they did in West Orange. They ruled against the plaintiffs on adequacy. I would bet very serious dollars today that the 9 judges on the Texas Supreme Court will rule against the plaintiffs on adequacy again. There's no reason, there's no testimony, no data any better, any different this time than in West Orange. If they didn't rule for adequacy in West Orange, they're definitely not going to rule for adequacy this time around. I think that on the equity issue, there may be a 40% chance, this is just my opinion, David, might be a 40% chance that the Supremes might agree with you on some element of the equity issue. I think there's a significantly higher chance than that the Texas Supreme Court will rule with us on the efficiency issue.
And so the upshot of that ruling will be what, practically speaking?
I think odds are we'll have a special section, the legislature, I keep talking in terms of we, Scott, we hadn't got over
It's hard
that.
to break that, it's all right. Go ahead.
I think that, in my opinion, the legislature will probably be in special session in the spring of 2014.
Spring, so you're actually putting it before the primary?
After
Oh,
the
you're
primary.
saying it is after. So
The governor would not call
I'm
it.
sorry,
I
I've
think,
reset my
before the primary.
expectations for the primary to May. Okay, so after the March primary, you would have the legislature come back and do a
I
special
think
session.
April or May next year, you very likely will see the legislature in special session.
Okay, Vice Chairman, what do you say about this? What is your prediction for where all this is going?
I've always avoided predictions. So I'm sitting here thinking about whether I should answer at all.
Oh, answer.
I don't like to second guess the court. I don't know what the court's going to do. And I was not involved in the lawsuit and wasn't sitting. I've only read.
But you have expertise and a brain. Tell us what you think.
I always like that about you, Evan.
It's nice to have both of those, too.
Yeah. I Kent talked about invitations. I think the court in West Orange Cove did not rule in favor of the adequacy argument, but said you're on the edge of the cliff. And if you come in with evidence that having been on the edge of the cliff, you have now A, raised standards, B, inflation has happened, C, guess what, you cut a whole lot of money. It's going to take some pretty fancy arguing to get you back off the edge of that cliff. And at least what I read of what the state filed, not having heard the testimony, I didn't see that fancy arguing going on.
Yeah.
Secondly, there's been a pretty consistent history on the equity issue. We're way askew on that, and I don't know that anybody even denies that with a straight face. To me, the question is, what is this legislature going to do? And what kind of pause does that give the Supreme Court in terms of saying, well, maybe you have new facts here? And does that change the timing any? And that becomes a legal question. I've never been a lawyer.
So in the end, Judge Dietz is upheld or not, in part or in whole?
At least in part.
At least in part. And
Yes.
the byproduct of that becomes what? A special session and more money probably have to go back into the system?
Depends on the timing. Maybe a special session, maybe the next regular session.
Maybe we
of the
just kick it into
legislature.
the next.
Yeah, and it's when you're in a time of increasing revenue, it's always easier to get closer on equity if you choose to do it. Because if you're putting money in, and just like I think the House has done this time, they put money in. There's some districts that aren't getting very much money out of that deal, but they know they've had more than everybody else all along. And so you can add in from the bottom to the extent that the leadership is willing to do this. They may be able to buy their way to a closer deal than what it would look like, what it did look like coming into the to the court case last summer.
David, let me guess. You think that they're going to uphold Judge Dietz?
Evan, I'm reminded, I think everybody's familiar with the phrase deja vu, experiencing something for the first time, but having the sensation of experiencing it before.
Seen this movie before, right? Yeah.
People are less familiar with the concept of jamais vu, which is doing the same thing over and over and not ever remembering or learning from it. And what I hope we get is a little break in the cycle, in all candor. And I think Scott just mentioned it. I do want to acknowledge we are in a session right now. I think the legislature, particularly with the House decision yesterday on the second supplemental,
Additional 500.
even the additional 500, the legislative actions right now are fairly significant. Frankly, it's the most significant response that I can recall ever seeing after a trial court decision.
We all thought they were going to hit the
simply
pause
waiting.
button, but they're actually
Right.
putting real money back into it.
And I want to commend them for that. I mean, I think our legislature is working really hard this session, and I do think we have to acknowledge that. And frankly, if that results in taking a look at what the legislature did after the session, I think
So
we
be
have to keep that. But both on the funding side and on the policy side, I think we're getting some very significant debate, and I do want to recognize and very definitely commend our elected officials for taking that look. I do believe that the Supreme Court eventually, whenever the case gets to the Supreme Court, will affirm Judge Dietz in whole or in part. They may choose to rule on all issues. They may pick one or two issues, focus on those. But I think, again, as long as you have a system that literally, as you have more needy kids, you get less money per WADA, that is almost definitionally unconstitutional in my mind. And so there are going to have to be some structural analyses and redo. Now, in terms of the additional revenue, I want to make a real statement here. We didn't get in trouble overnight, and we're not going to solve all of these problems overnight. One of the changes that we need, what I hope we don't get is simply a cathartic reaction where the legislature has a special session, we're up against a gun, we dump a little money into schools and say, okay, that bought us 5 or 6 years apiece. it'll be somebody else's problem.
What's changed?
And then we don't look at it again for 6 years. And that is a tragic cycle. And what we need to do is have sustained interest over multiple sessions that actually starts by saying, what are our standards?
Yeah.
What are our standards? What are the needs of our kids? And what does it take to get our kids to the standards that we just set for all kids? I used the example in closing argument, I said, did the legislature order the state highway department to build any bridges that weren't funded? And would you want to drive on that bridge?
It'll take their toll.
I mean, it's kind of almost commonsensical. You have to have a connection between what your goals are, what you set as your objectives, and a means to that goal. And I think that's going to be not something that we do just sort of in a cathartic special session where everybody gets to say, okay, thank gosh, that's off my plate. But it's going to take some sustained attention over a period of sessions. That's what I hope we see.
Chairman, maybe we do need a toll road version of public education, right?
Exactly. We'll cross that bridge.
That's what Kent's proposing.
As long as we don't burn that bridge.
Well, yeah, we'll burn that bridge.
Chairman, what's going to happen?
Well, I'm going to get my voice back, and then you're going to hear
And then I'm going to...
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Evan, for having me here. I'm among probably 3 people that I've known as long as I've been in the legislature and longer.
Even before.
Good. And that's why it gets rowdy, because we've known each other so long, and we've had these arguments, but never in front of a bunch of people. But and
Sometimes with
happy
more
to provide that
alcohol
opportunity.
but the neat thing is we respect each other, and we still have that great affinity.
Yeah.
Anyway, the legislature in its history, or at least what I'm aware of, is really good at incremental change. They're not very good at all at transformational change. And that's what's going to have to happen. And that's why we've been nibbling at the data, and that's why I've been worried about the data and productivity. In fact, when I first talked to Ken about efficiency, he said, Rob, efficiency is cheap. Productivity is doing something. And in fact, it was Kent that taught me about that. And we have some really good people running our schools now. They have not been given the right goals. Okay, right now we have an accountability system that's largely demographically driven. Okay, your exemplar, if you get 90% of your kids, we got school districts up there that have 0 to 2, 3% free and reduced lunch, and they're just going to show up, and 90% of them are going to pass the test. And of course, that goes back to before they even got to school, and that's another story. You can read the Hart Risley study of Kansas City in 1995. I did remember that author. Good. So,
Where were you when I needed readings from my class?
by the way, I've read more since I've been at public ed than ever.
So where does the court go, Chairman? Let's go there.
So when we look at adequacy and equity, and I'll condense my deposition, and the way the system works, who was a guy, never met a man he didn't like.
Will Rogers.
Will Rogers. Will Rogers said there are 2 things the American public should not witness the manufacture of: sausage and laws. And that's how our school finance system got the way it was. Oh, we're going to hold you harmless, so we'll get your votes. Every school finance plan has passed, except for one, by how much more money the school districts are going to get, because it's a complicated issue. It's a very emotional issue, and people don't want to delve into it too much and get in. Now Scott and I will go after some of the little details, but that's okay. Nobody cares what we're talking about. But
Not anymore.
Exactly. Well, that's true. but the point is, we need to give our school leaders a better target. Right now, we have a compliance system. We need a performance-based system, okay? And you know what a good reward is to a good superintendent, like a Gene Buinger, whose Hurst Julius Bedford has been #1 the last 5 years in productivity, in achievement per dollar spent. They want less regulation. They want less regulation. Get the state out of my business. And they're already proven they can do it. And to the adequacy issue, David, I always say, you know, I don't know how much it costs to really educate a kid, but I sure know what we spend. And if you look at some of the data, if we just, the top 200 school districts educate 80% of the kids in Texas, the top 10 school districts have 1 million kids. Yeah. And if we just, if we just, the top 200, if you took the top quartile, the number 50, you know, you could reallocate, you could find $3.5 billion, and in the whole system, about $5 billion a year. So where's the money going to come from? I say it comes from increased productivity,
right,
because that's where you're going to generate the money. Good companies, when they need to expand, find a lot of it from within.
Well, the question is really not so much where's the money going to come from, as what is the court going to do? What do you think the court is going to do?
Well, I think for the first time, because, look at, I'm leaning forward now.
Yeah.
For the first time, the Supreme Court has given every indication that they want to hear about efficiency. And they mentioned it, I think, in the last 3 or 4, you know, Edgewood 16, I think they even mentioned, I'm kidding, there were 4 Edgewoods. But they would like to know a little bit more about efficiency. And I think the Tree Group, whether they've been successful or not, has raised the issue. So I think it'll be considered. And the other part is what I start off with is, you know, we're not the federal government. We can't print money, okay? The money's got to come from somewhere. So we need to find ways to spend it better. It's not how much you spend, it's how well you spend it. And I think the key in our school districts, the ones that do the better job, have greater leaders. So we need to do a better job in training our leaders, because in school finance, they get, what, 3 hours to become a superintendent, which means they turn it over to their business superintendent and say, how much are we getting? And then they go from there. So I think we'll see that. You'll see a better movement towards financial literacy in the school business, because we have good people running our schools.
All right, well, we're going to stop there. I'm not sure whether we know what the court's going to do after that, but we'll see. And let's go to questions from the audience for the balance of our time. Take as many as we have time to take. Please respect our need to end this before dark. There first, before dark. Yeah, there,
Before dark.
There first,
I guess that means I don't
and
get to
next. Ma'am.
Ma'am, stand up. Okay.
Sure.
Excuse me. My name's Deb Haas. I dabble in this stuff when I'm not driving carpool. So
Okay.
I want to sort of start with Chairman Eisler's point and work backwards. Since you're talking about efficiency and productivity, I'd like to know in what other industry we might look for a model in which we say, here's your goal, here's your problem. Every year we're going to make it harder. We're going to give you more things to fix. We're going to raise the standards. We're going to pay you less. And we're going to measure your performance as much on the basis of your kids as they come into the classroom, whether or not they all come in at the same place, as how much progress you make with them. Because that's the model I see for education right now, and it's not the model I see in any other successful industry.
You agree with the premise?
What, you mean as you mature, your industry matures? I went to the Computer Museum in Boston. There were no explosions back then, but and they had on the wall, if the car industry were like the computer industry, we'd be driving $5 Cadillacs by now. And the computer industry has been that way, where the prices come down. How many people know how much you pay per minute for long distance? As they say in the convent, none, right? Because the competition has brought it down. The car industry, okay? When the Japanese cars came out, they were doing $10 an hour labor, and Detroit was 18. Detroit got killed, okay? So the competition caused more productivity. And can the schools be more productive? If we devise a system where they can share good ideas, best practices. Right now they do, but they don't have any reason to do it. Schools are very competitive. They're very proud of what they do. First thing you see when you go on a campus, any campus, is the trophy case. They're very proud of what they do, and they do a good job.
David,
but we don't give them.
Competition solve this problem?
The worst industries to look at, Deb, are the car industry or any other industry that is an assembly line production model, or where you have control of your inputs. Schools are not assembly lines, and we don't control inputs. We're going to educate every kid that shows up. Every parent sends his or her children to schools with high expectations. The industry that is the most comparable is the healthcare industry, because it functions the same. It is something that we have a universal sense that everybody needs, wants, expects, has some expectation, and it's also very labor intensive. And I don't think it's a surprise that you see some of the same debates about access to quality in the healthcare industry that we are talking about in education. Those are the two most analogous.
That's a good point.
Looking at manufacturing assembly line production models are absolutely the wrong place to get good information for schools.
Let me go there, right next to you, Mr. Greenfield, and then come over here to this gentleman. Sir.
Thank you, Evan, and let me congratulate you and your outstanding staff for receiving the Knight Foundation Award.
Thank you.
Here.
Thank you.
I think that was quite outstanding.
Thank you.
Now, my question, and I'll try not to be too sarcastic.
I think you've already failed.
God, well, my UT degree is not all that great.
All right.
Distinguished panelists, all of you have been intimately involved in developing a, quote, Texas solution to provide an equitable, world-class education to all Texas students. From your experience, do you have any suggestions to your former colleagues developing a, quote, Texas solution for providing health care coverage to everyone?
Yeah.
No.
Not me.
My solution was always look at the way Mr. Coleman was voting
You
and
want to
follow
slide
along.
down to Bannister
I call
there?
point of order on that
Do
question.
you call a point of order? I may uphold it, actually.
I think the first bill I ever filed was health savings accounts, to where you could save money against a high deductible, and that will work.
You were an early adopter, weren't you?
You know, the problem, if you get too far ahead, you get smoked.
Mr. Greenfield, I promise if you ask that question next week at the health symposium we do in this room, we'll get an answer, I swear.
I know, I wanted these guys to provide the group experts.
Well, we'll see, actually. Sir.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank you all for being here. I've learned a lot of cool things, like the difference between deja vu and
Jamais vu, yeah,
Jamais
right.
vu.
French class is
Rouge a
dismissed,
day.
that's right.
And,
Yes, sir.
I liked what was said about incremental versus transformational change. And so I just real quick want to, who's in the room? Do we have people from AISD here?
What?
Any from the charter schools?
Over here.
Tracy Young, right over there, I see.
Okay. I'm the project leader for the Austin District Charter Compact. It's a Gates-funded initiative. There's 16 cities trying to be laboratories of innovation for how public school leaders collaborate together. I convene the leaders of each of these school systems in Austin. One of the things that we've learned from the 16 compact cities is what we think the transformational change should lead to. So do we all agree on that stake on the ground that we're trying to get to? Where are we now? Where are we trying to go? How do we get there? And so the elements that we found are a focus on student, not districts. Each student gets money, student-based funding.
I need to be Alex Trebek here and ask you to
Yeah.
phrase this in the form of a question. I'm sorry. Yeah.
The question is, I was going to give 4 or 5 premises based on what the leading laboratories of innovation have identified as the stake in the ground that should define whether we've accomplished this transformational change. Do you guys agree with this premise? And where does student-based financing, or I'm sorry, where does this financing debate fit into this? And what can the legislature do to not stand in the way, but facilitate realizing this end goal vision? The premises being focus on student,
Yep.
money for the student, school choice system, common enrollment system that enables that, and deregulation so that schools have a level playing field.
Well, those are all issues to some degree that are in play right now, right, in this
He
session.
basically outlined our
He
lawsuit.
did. He did.
So the question is, what can the legislature do to facilitate that?
Like they say in real estate, lots. And
Oh, Eisler, I've missed you.
I want to take
I
that
mean,
one.
yeah, I'll let you take it. I mean, speaking of softballs, that's the Cat Osterman pitch of all time, actually. Go ahead.
First of all, I love the question.
Yeah, I bet.
Basically, you touched on most of the points in our lawsuit. Our case basically is saying, you know, without the ability for consumer sovereignty and the ability for supply side change, that a system can never be efficient. So there is going, in my opinion, there will have to be transformational change, which brings us back to the purpose of our lawsuit and the purpose of the court system to begin with. The Texas Constitution requires an efficient system of public free schools. The court interpreted that in 1989, the Supreme Court ruling, to mean an equitable system as well as an efficient system. In their first Edgewood ruling, they said it has to be efficient, and efficient means productive of results with little waste. But then they said it also has to be equitable. That's a component of efficiency.
Yep.
So what happened is, in the legislature, we could never bring ourselves politically to deal with the issue of equity. I mean, it was fought every session. There was all the, you have the fight between the haves and the have-nots, and my school district, how much, like Rob said, how much is my school district going to get is the bottom line, what it always came down to. So the Supreme Court said equity is a component of efficiency. So therefore, we went through, I don't know how many special sessions and 4 rounds of litigation, 5 if you count the 2 separate Edgewood 3 rulings, I believe it was, or Edgewood 2. One of them had A and a B. But anyway, we went through several rounds of litigations. I don't know how many special sessions. Ann Richards put a constitutional amendment on the ballot that the people of Texas rejected by a 2-to-1 ratio. But we're trying to solve the equity problem. Well, today, we've got an efficiency problem. What the court's been implying all of these years, and every round of litigation, they repeat this, that efficiency means productive of results with little waste. That's been repeated in every school finance lawsuit. They keep reminding us that it doesn't just mean equity, it means productive of results with little waste. So now, in my opinion, after we win this lawsuit next spring, the legislature will have to refocus on efficiency just as it did in 1989 through 1995 and focused on finding the solution to equity. So I think the real issue that the court has been hinting at, and more compellingly hinting at it every additional ruling, is finally before the court in the issue of efficiency. And it will address exactly the points you're making. Briefly, we pled in our pleadings that the cap on charter schools is arbitrary and therefore unconstitutional. We pled that the deregulation issue you raised, we pled in our pleadings that school districts should be deregulated just like charter schools are. If charters are producing more efficiently, then why not free school districts and allow them to be more productive in the way they spend their money? Then specifically, we talked about a lot of the labor laws and the other regulations, and I won't get into our entire pleadings, but bottom line, you sort of outlined in our pleading, and I think that will be the issue that will be before the legislature next year. And bottom line, I'll close at this point, Evan, bottom line, this is one of these issues that the legislature will not deal with on its own.
Have to have a gun put to its head.
You have to have the court, and in fact, I think what the legislature is doing this session is actually helping our case, because what they pled for was more money and less accountability, and the legislature seems to be heading in that direction of more money and less accountability.
I want to go to this issue of choice, because one of the things that's come up, both the questioner and Mr. Grusendorf's point is we need expanded competition or choice. The legislature, which is now 95 Republicans in the House, 19 Republicans in the Senate, you'd think that the composition of the legislature might be very favorable to a more expanded choice option, has kind of backed off of what was ambitiously presented at the beginning of the session. It's kind of like, if you can't pass this with this legislature, when are you ever going to be able to pass it, right?
I said before that I had Yes Prep and KIPP and Ser Niños, some high-rated charter schools in my district, and in fact, KIPP started at Sharpstown High School in my district.
Indeed.
But I also have Sharpstown High School, and I have Lee High School. And so when we talk about choice, there is no effective choice for an awful lot of the kids that are in those schools, because my friends at Yes and KIPP and Ser Niños aren't taking the kids with tremendous special needs. They're not taking, in fact, in general, they're not running very large high schools at all, where a lot of the problems and challenges and costs come about.
You've
They're
got
not
charters
ta-
that specialize in special needs kids, Scott, so you're that's a good spin, but it's not always true.
I sure don't see them in my part of town, Kent. We don't have the kids that have the persistent psychological problems. You don't have the kids that have the gang and drug issues who are in our schools, and we hold our schools responsible for getting educations. And
Sir,
Let me
I
finish.
appreciate your
You can
enthusiasm.
disagree with me,
You got your
but
question,
let
now
me
let's
just-
get your answer. It's fine.
let me.
Sir, please, out of respect for our panelists, let him answer your question.
When they don't make it at Yes, they come back to the other schools. And those schools struggle with them, and those schools work hard for them. And I would like to have options for them, but guess what? At least in my part of town, they don't exist. They are not there. I got a lot of charter schools. I've got some of the best charter schools, but they're not serving the same population of kids that are left behind in the other schools. In fact, the kids who are at Yes and KIPP and Ser Niños are not the kids whose parents aren't engaged enough to even get them in the lottery to get there. They're not the ones that we go on the dropout walks to go out and recover, where we have to beg kids to come back.
So you opposed to an increase in the number of charters, Mr. Howard?
No, I am not opposed to increasing the number of charters, although here, what I proposed last session, and it never really got anywhere, but it was in our discussions in committee, was that we make some of those slots by filtering out some of the ones on the bottom that aren't doing the job. Right. And that we take below a certain level and have to have them compete for a re-up on their license rather than having to essentially automatically get renewed. We can make a lot of room, and I mean, we have demonstrated that the marketplace doesn't entirely work because we still have a lot of parents or a lot of kids on their own going to charter schools that simply don't work at all.
Let me let
respond
Mr. Thompson, let me let Mr. Grisdorf quickly respond, then you, and then I'm being told we have to stop. The problem is, of course, it gets going, and then you want to keep going. Go ahead, Mr. Grisdorf, and then Mr. Thompson.
Well, I carried the charter school bill in 1995 on the House side. We folded it into Senate Bill 1. The law specifically requires that charter schools, if they have more applicants than spaces, they have to accept those students on a lottery basis. So they can't cream, they can't refuse to take these kids. The law prevents it.
All right.
With the exception that...
Real quickly, Senate Bill 2, I want to comment because we're in the middle of a legislative session right now. Senate Bill 2 by Chairman Patrick, which is already passed out of the Senate, it's going to be heard this coming week in the House, is a good bill. It raises the cap on charters, creates a mechanism to close, a more expedited mechanism to close some of the non-performing charters, and allows school districts to operate a certain number of their campuses under some of the flexibility that is provided to charters. I think it's a very creative, very good piece of legislation. I expect to see it move forward. And so I think, let's go back to the Constitution. Constitution there's a number of buzzwords. Kent, when he says it, the emphasis falls on the word efficient system of public free schools. Efficient's a modifier. I want to remind everybody the object of the statement is a system of public free schools. Public funds are raised and spent, and the constitutional duty for the legislature is to provide for public schools. Free schools in a system.
That's not what the
It's exactly what it
Constitution
says.
says or meant,
Kent,
David.
that's exactly what it
What
says.
did the Constitution
Wait a
say?
minute. Let me finish this statement here. So I think choice options within a public school system are great in every school district in Texas. We need to continue to look for ways to provide those because not every school fits every kid. Charters are going to be part of that. But choice, if we're talking about using public dollars with little or no accountability for private purposes in private schools, I do not think that's what the Constitution is.
Please take the last word on this. We can be talking about this for 5 days.
This opens a real another area.
Smallest
But
can of worms
the
ever, please.
idea that public funds can only go to what we today call public schools is nonsense. In Edgewood 4, the Supreme Court told us specifically that you can that the legislature has the right to establish a system of education. It does not have to be run by the public system or the government schools. And if you look at the constitutional history, we had community schools in place for several decades after the 1876 Constitution was adopted, and you had the state basically funding private schools through the school fund. So this issue of public, today we think of public meaning publicly run. Is a public theater publicly run? It's a public theater. A public restaurant, the legal term public, and David knows this better than I do, the legal term public doesn't mean publicly run and publicly
It does
operated.
mean open to all,
And the Constitution requires a system of schools. They can be public or private. Edgewood 4 said that. And so that's just
It means open to all.
a misrepresentation of what the Constitution says and what the constitutional founders intended, because their clear intent, in fact, if you read through the Constitutional Convention debates, which I've done, they talk about the fact that it was really the intent to fund some of the private, even parochial schools. But then they specifically changed some language there because they didn't want Catholic schools to be funded. That's a whole other area.
We will come back to the LBJ school if the LBJ school will have us, and we'll have a panel discussion about choice, I swear. For now, we've landed the plane safely. It didn't look like we would necessarily, but we did. Thank Chairman Eisler, Chairman Grusendorf, Vice Chairman Hochberg, and Mr. Thompson. Thank you all. Thank you, LBJ School.
Good to be with you.